What's up, guys? John Ross here for Ross Racing with another YouTube video. I got my buddy Tony Wagner behind the camera today. You can check out his racing videos on TikTok at, was it Wagner Racing?
Yeah, Wagner Racing.
Cool. So yeah, thanks to him for helping out today. But today we're going to be tearing down this old truck motor that's going to eventually become another power plant for the B-Mod. So I got this for $200 off of Facebook Marketplace, and I got it cheap because it's got a little bit of, or allegedly it ran good, but it had a bit of a rod knock. So I don't know if you want to come in here, Tony, and you can hear it's a little loosey-goosey on the inside. Luckily, all we actually need really out of this deal is the block. So hopefully, as long as there isn't like a spun main bearing or something cracked in the block itself, that rod knock shouldn't be a problem for us. The other thing that I want to mention about this motor real quick before we start tearing it down, this is from like the late 90s Vortec series of small blocks. They were the last of the Gen 1 small block Chevys. And these heads, the Vortec heads, are actually pretty sought after by people that want to build a small block Chevy using OEM parts. They're allegedly some of the best heads that GM ever made. So I'm hoping we're going to pull these heads off, and we're actually going to probably get them crack checked. And if they're good, then we basically will be able to sell them and say we got this motor. I dropped the socket. We'll basically be able to sell these heads if they're any good, and say that we got this motor for free. So that's what I'm hoping. They are prone to cracking, but yeah, all that's left to do is just tear into this thing and see what we find. So we're going to start obviously by pulling the intake off of this thing. And if you're in the market for a junkyard engine, there's some differences here that you'll notice with the later model Vortec or kind of 90s era throttle body injected small blocks that are a little bit different from what you might be used to with the older muscle car engines. So there's your crab core distributor. Don't need that. So the intake bolt pattern is actually different for the later model engines versus the older small blocks. Rather than having I guess it would be, 12 bolts holding it down, you only have these 8 corner bolts. And instead of going at an angle down the head, they actually go straight up and down. And they're also rather than being 3/8, I believe they're 5/16. So we're gonna pop this intake off. See what we can see down in the lifter valley. Another kind of quick thing that you can notice with the more late model engines is they'll have these center bolt valve covers rather than the perimeter bolt valve covers that you see on the older style heads. If you're buying an engine not to completely rebuild it, like what we're doing, like if you're actually wanting to use the engine more as is, this is obviously something that you really got to do and check ahead of time. See what's going on under the valve covers. Obviously somebody's been in here at some point because they put a nice aftermarket valve cover gasket on. But everything looks pretty much in order under that valve cover. We're probably going to have to beat on it a little bit to get it off. Not as much as I expected. Sweet. And what you see in there is the thing that makes the Vortec series of engines, like the later small blocks, unique, and that's that this thing is set up for has a factory setup for roller lifters. That's the spider deal that holds the lifters in place, keeps them from spinning. You know, with roller lifters, you want them to ride straight on the cam lobe. You don't want them to spin to establish a wear pattern like you do with flat tappet lifters. Obviously for us, for the B mods, you know, that doesn't really mean anything, but if we wanted to build an A mod motor later, that does give us a little bit more options for lifters we can run. But man, this thing allegedly had like 300,000 miles on it. There's definitely some sludge in there. Good gooey stuff. But yeah, next step is going to be to pop all the valve train off and pop these heads off. Alright, well, we're about ready to pull these heads off. Before we do that, I want to show something down here in the lifter valley, Tony, if you want to come in here. One thing that you're likely to run into when you're tearing down a high mileage motor such as this is the lifters don't want to come back out. They're all kind of stuck in there. And that's because of wear either on the lifter itself or on the lifter bore over the 300 some odd thousand miles that this engine allegedly ran. You don't want to force that because you're likely to cause all kinds of issues. And you can't get the lifters out, they don't slide out easily. What you got to do is wait till the end after you've removed the cam and everything, push them back through to the bottom, which we'll do later. And then definitely when this thing goes to the machine shop, it's going to have all of the lifter bores at least honed, and if they're really badly worn or have a ridge in them, they may actually have to oversize them and press some bronze bushings into them to get them back to the proper clearance to allow that flat tappet lifter to spin like it needs to develop the wear pattern that it needs and do what it needs to do to not go flat. But we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. For now, let's see if we can get these Vortec heads off and hopefully try to take care of them as we're doing it. We don't want to bang them up because if we're lucky, they won't be cracked and we might be able to sell them for a decent amount. So with that in mind, I'm actually going to go through and pop all these bolts loose, get the torque off of them by hand, and I'm going to do that in the same torque sequence that you would do if you were bolting the heads down. All right, so we got one head off. We're getting ready to pull the other head off. And Tony asked a good question off camera there. He's like, so you're only doing this for the block. What happens if the block isn't usable? Well, that's a risk that we're taking. So if it's not, then, hopefully the heads are good. We can sell them and move on to the next one. And actually, as I was telling him, the last block that I did this with, actually the block ended up being cracked and I spent $200 on nothing. But a good sign here so far. So we got the heads off. We can see the cylinders. On the last one that I tore down, I found, you can see the tops of the pistons are all completely coated in carbon. Just, they're black from all the time this engine has spent running. On the previous one that I tore down, there was one piston that the top of that piston was completely clean, bare shiny metal. And what that told me is water had been getting into that cylinder. The guy that I bought it from told me that the head was cracked, which I believe because that's actually a pretty common problem, as I mentioned, with these heads. Unfortunately, it wasn't the head that was cracked; it was the block. And if the cylinder bore is cracked, then they could sleeve that, although that costs extra money. And for a dime a dozen block like this, it might not be worth it. But in that case, it was actually the surface of the deck was cracked, like the surface that the head bolts to. and that's technically repairable, but not ideal. Yeah, this motor's definitely been apart in the past. We kind of mentioned that already. These are aftermarket Fel-Pro head gaskets. So at least we know when they went through it, they used some good shit. So we're just about ready to flip this thing over and start pulling the bottom end apart. One thing that's, so when you're tearing an old motor down like this, one thing that's important to notice is the amount of ridge that develops at the top of each bore. But yeah, you can see around the top of the cylinder bore where the top ring stops. You can actually feel with your finger there's a little bit of a ridge there. Now, similar to the ridge that develops in the lifter bores, that's going to create a problem, or can potentially create a problem when we go to pop the cylinders out, or to pop the pistons out of the cylinders, I mean. If you're wanting to reuse any of these parts and there's a ridge there, you definitely need to use a ridge reamer tool to cut it down, because otherwise there's a good chance you're going to break either the ring or the piston itself in the process of removing it. In this scenario, I'm actually pretty surprised based on how many miles they said were on this engine. This ridge really isn't all that bad. Like, you can feel it with your finger, but it's not like super noticeable. So with that in mind, I'm not worried about cracking the block, and I'm not worried about saving these pistons. So we're just not even going to worry about that ridge. We're just going to flip this thing over and we're going to bang the pistons out of it. Alright, so we got her flipped over, got the oil pan off. Let's see if we can figure out which one of these rods had that rod knock. And it may not even be, I think if anything it's maybe this one is a little loose. But I actually don't see anything like catastrophic, like any rods that have started to blue and change colors, that would indicate a bearing failure. So if anything, I think she's just a little wore out. It's not, there's no sign of actual catastrophic failure. One unfortunate thing, I guess, is that this is only a 2-bolt main block. It doesn't have the wider 4-bolt main caps on the 3 center mains. But for a B-mod motor, that's not really going to hurt us at all. This 2-bolt main block will be plenty strong enough for what we want to do. Now, obviously, as I mentioned before, if you're wanting to reuse any of this stuff, you got to be careful and do everything in the right torque sequence and all that. We're not going to be reusing any of these rods or pistons, so I'm just going to knock them loose. This part in particular, removing the caps off of the crank, if you're going to reuse the crankshaft, you got to be real careful not to let the studs nick the crank journal on the way out, and you also got to be real careful that you keep your caps oriented properly and with the same rod that they came with, because those are honed to size after being bolted together. That came out no problem. That little bit of a ridge didn't bother it at all. If I didn't know better, I would actually assume this engine had been rebuilt at some point during its service life. Usually, if that's the case, though, and they go through and bore the block like what we're going to do when we build it into a race motor, you'll see a stamping on the pistons that will say, 030, 040, 060, and that would indicate to you that it's a rebuilder piston, that they've bored the block over by 30 thousandths, 40 thousandths, 60 thousandths. The one thing that I am trying to be careful about, even though I'm not concerned about saving the rods and pistons, is I am trying to make sure that as I'm removing them, I'm not gouging the cylinder walls with the bolts or anything like that, because we don't want to have to create unnecessary extra work for ourselves down the road when we go to have to take this thing to the machine shop. It's definitely one of those deals where you got to be willing to get your hands a little bit dirty.
I feel like that'll make a good little short clip.
I'm going to start the video off with that. Well, it's the next day and we've finished the disassembly on this engine. As you can see, we've got the main caps laid out, got the crank out of it. Obviously, it's important to keep your main caps all in order if you're going to be reusing them, which, if you're doing any sort of stock rebuild, you probably are. Unfortunately, though, we discovered the reason why this engine was sold so cheap, the reason why it had oil pressure issues, or maybe a symptom of that. These main saddles are all messed up. It had 3 spun main bearings. The center 3 main bearings were spun, and you can see even the ones that weren't are in bad shape. But the problem with that is there's really not much we can do to salvage this block, unfortunately. You can see where that used to be a nice straight edge there. As the bearing spun, it basically machined away a bunch of material. And, it is probably possible to, do some kind of operation to save this block, but it's not going to be cost effective to do it. Usually when you spin a main bearing, if you get the engine shut down quick enough, it's the cap that takes the brunt of the damage. And you can see, look at that lip there. That should all just be a flat surface across. But unfortunately, this thing was run long enough with the spun bearings to just completely waller out the main axis of the crankshaft. So hopefully these heads are salvageable and we can get some of our money back. But otherwise, it's just on to the next one. Try to find another block, do the same process, and hope that we bought a better one next time. So until then, we'll see you guys in the next video.